We've finally got some answers about Sukuna's flame arrow and the binding vow that goes along with it. So let's dive into it, but if you're not caught up through chapter 259 of the manga, spoilers beware. Alright, so in chapter 258, we see Sukuna whip this out again, pause, and in 259, we see him unleash it, and this is where we get some more information about this. So first of all, it is just part of his shrine technique. Again, I believe the word is kamino, which basically equates to like a kitchen furnace or a kitchen hearth. And what we're told is that it is a necessary precursor for him to use cleave and dismantle before he can open the door to the kitchen stove, as it were. Now, this is going to come into play a little bit later, so I will expand on that. But basically what we know is that he can't just open this willy-nilly whenever he chooses. There are requirements to do so. And in particular, he has crafted a binding vow around using it with his domain. So that is the binding vow that is referenced in chapter 259. Alright, so let's break this down. And again, the fire arrow can only be used after cleave and dismantle have paved the way, essentially. And this is likened to the way a chef will chop up his ingredients before cooking them, because this whole cooking and eating thing has been prevalent with Sukuna throughout the entire series, right? So this is just a continuation of that theme. What we're then told is that the fire is extremely powerful, but the trade-off is that it moves very slowly and it's got a very small range of effect. So in order to combat this, Sukuna placed a binding vow on himself, where he can only use it against one target. So he can't use the fire arrow against a lot of people at once, except during a domain expansion. So the binding vow, put simply, is this. In exchange for making the fire arrow faster and have a larger area of effect, he will never use it against multiple opponents, except during domain expansions. Now, this exception for domain expansions is really clever and interesting, because if Sukuna expands his domain and everything within that radius is getting slashed up by cleave and dismantle, what that is essentially doing is creating like this dust, right? Just the residue of everything that has been completely annihilated. And the property of that dust, those remains, if you will, has this like explosive cursed energy property that when Sukuna uses the fire arrow, it basically alights everything in the domain. So everything that has just been destroyed basically becomes this tinder for a massive chemical explosion. So in effect, this is a really interesting and clever workaround, because the fire arrow itself, due to the restrictions on it, isn't really what's causing this massive explosion within the domain. It is merely the spark that is lighting the fuse. And the cherry on top, we're told, is that Sukuna alters the barrier of his domain expansion when he's doing this, that basically causes it to be hermetically sealed, meaning everything is going to just be contained and trapped within this massive explosion. No living things are permitted to enter or exit while this is going on, so it is quite literally just a death trap. This is why the narrator describes this as his ultimate technique, because it sets off an instantaneous chain of reactions that results in a massive explosion, extreme levels of heat, shock waves, decompression, and super high pressure. Like, this is absolutely insane, bringing all living creatures inside to their end. And a really cool behind-the-scenes detail about all of this is that Gege brought in a science advisor named Kurare to supervise this chapter, to go over all of the science, if you will, to make sure it makes sense and is grounded in reality. So the way Sukuna's fire arrow ignites the chemicals and causes this chain reaction and explosion and depressurization and all of that, that is grounded in real science. And I just really appreciate that attention to detail and extra mile, if you will, to make the story just that much more believable and enjoyable. And Kurare has also worked on JJK before in the Hikari and Kashimo fight, and also extensively on Dr. Stone, which, if you're familiar with that manga, you know it's a lot of science. So this guy knows what he's talking about. So, Gege has also gone out and got PhDs in mathematics to help explain infinity. And, just like I said, I appreciate that extra effort and that attention to detail. And just to get out ahead of this, before anybody says, well, see, Sukuna could have used the fire arrow against Gojo, he could have beaten him at any time, and he didn't even need the 10 Shadows or Mahoraga. That's not true, and Gege even goes out of his way to have the narrator explain this during the chapter, where he basically says that due to the constant domain clashes between Gojo and Sukuna, where both of them were continuously adjusting the parameters of their domains and their barriers and their conditions, that because of that, the fire arrow wasn't wasn't really a choice for Sukuna to use. It wouldn't have been able to generate enough power, and so that's why Sukuna sealed it away and didn't use it against Gojo. He wasn't intentionally holding it back or anything. And now knowing how all of this works, it also sheds some light on how and why Sukuna chose to do this against Mahoraga. Now obviously Mahoraga had adapted to cleave and dismantle or slashing attacks, whatever you want to call it, so he needed something else. But the interesting way of setting up the domain to set up for this enormous, chemical death ball now makes perfect sense. Because even though Mahoraga is just one individual, so Sukuna could have just used the fire arrow without opening the domain, by opening the domain, he again sets up this massive death trap that is going to assuredly take out Mahoraga. If he hadn't have used the domain as a precursor, then perhaps Mahoraga could have dodged the fire arrow, or perhaps it just wouldn't have been a big enough area or powerful enough to completely wipe him out in one go. But this way, it obviously would. And let's go ahead and talk about the only other time we've seen Sukuna use the fire arrow, and that was against Jogo. And in this case, he didn't open the domain prior to using it, but it's because he didn't need to. First of all, Jogo is only one person, so Sukuna didn't need the domain in order to make this an area of effect to hit multiple people. Also, he didn't need the domain in terms of it having just a large area of effect in general. Jogo is very small and standing right in front of him. And for that same reason, he doesn't need the domain's instantaneous chain reaction effect because Jogo is just sitting there facing him head on. Both are going to give their all in this strike, and what happens, happens. So that is perfectly in line with Sukuna just using his regular flame arrow because all of its normal weaknesses are moot in this circumstance. So yeah, it is just so satisfying to finally get some answers and clarifications on these things that we've been wondering about for so long. And this generally all makes sense to me and checks out. I'm very intrigued about this, cooking connection. Like, how exactly does the cleave and dismantle open the door for the furnace? Like, thematically, I understand, but I'm curious if we're going to get any more clarification on mechanically exactly how it works. And again, with the domain, I get that. You're slicing everything up to basically set up the huge chemical explosion. But when you're not using the domain, I'm curious about how the precursor cleave and dismantle actually work. And I still think eating has to be a part of this, right? Cooking, you chop it up, you cook it. The final thing there is you got to eat what you cooked, right? So I'm still very curious to see that. And I want to see if we could maybe see Yuji's version of this. Anyways, y'all, that's all for this one. I just wanted to make this video and help clarify the flame arrow and the binding vow because I've seen a lot of confusion and discourse about this after the recent chapter. So let me know what your thoughts are if you disagree with any of the interpretations I've made here, because of course, as time goes on and we get more translations and more clarifications, there could be some nuance in some of this, but for the most part, I think this is how it works. But definitely let me know your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.